Alright, so now I wanted to start a discussion in the wake of my grandfather's passing. Um, One of the things that happened that I really appreciated, obviously, in addition to the support of good family and seeing people you hadn't seen in a while, and I actually got some outreach from you guys in the community, and that was really cool too. I appreciate that. But one of the things, as his grandson, that was interesting was, of course, a lot of people coming up and noticing the similarities between us, as some of the older people in the family were able to say, we look very similar to each other at this stage in my life as well. But this kind of got me thinking about some of the things I've been talking about philosophically lately, and just the idea of really harmony in general. Because there's discussions going on, of course, constantly in regards to ancestry and going about what's the importance of the sort of biological meaning behind looking like your peers, if you will. And I think a lot of people, especially intellectually, look down upon this. Especially on the kind of lib left, if you will. And I think it's totally wrong and disingenuous, because this is just simply their interpretation of the material. The material is, in a way, kind of like how Leibniz saw the monad. There's, these potentials and possibilities, within these material structures that are being sustained, of course, by God and his arguments. But I don't want to necessarily focus on that. I want to talk more about Plato and Young. And, it's not necessarily a very original correlation, of course. Plato, and you think of the Greeks and the Euclidean geometry and their discoveries. Plato was, playing with the archetypes of reality in a very profound way that I don't really think most people, especially today, even appreciate truly, including myself. It really is incredible what Plato really has to offer, even today. Well, of course, that's just us. But, there was someone was talking about how, in the Republic, there's just so much relevancy to right now and just any time, really, in any point in history. I think there's just something to gain from the Republic, right? And so I think part of that is, of course, his way of being able to, see reality as a sort of archetype. And, quite similar is how, Jung used archetypes of psychoanalytics as the forefather of that dimension. And that is, the use of stories and myth towards, forming an almost kind of archetype of epistemology and a sort of way of realizing that, stories are always going to be what sticks with you over particulars. And so, yeah, there is, particular instances with me and my grandfather, but ultimately there is only stories that he's passed down and stories that I had with him that will be passed down. And that is really at the forefront of what an education really truly is, in my mind. And I think the trouble is you see so many smarter people than myself who are just totally stuck in this sort of text and, just kind of fact-based, morality of looking at the world. They don't actually build any sort of lessons because they aren't able to appreciate the structures before them. Jung talks about, the human body almost as a time machine. These organs are what is able to form this sort of archetype in psychoanalytics that he has to offer. In order for archetypes to be able to be visible, in order for it to be intelligible, it ultimately requires that our lineage has to have a role. And to be able to downplay that is just, in my mind, silly. And I think really what I'm trying to, hark back to now is, the lack of appreciation towards, wanting to not necessarily align yourself completely in your way of life towards, seeking out, wanting to, maintain a lineage or whatever the case may be, but the lack of appreciation for, wanting to identify with that way of life, I think is the problem, really. And so I think really those critiques fail because they don't really actually understand fully what it means to, have, living relatives who, look like you, because obviously that's going to play a factor to, your cognitive functions and how you're going to actually think about the world as well. We always are talking about, being creatures of the mind, and, we like to think that these body properties are so secondary, but, time and time again, I think we're finding that it's not so simple. And I think, that's really why Jung is even able to do the work he was able to, is through this understanding of, the body is able to have these sort of functions that we can, obtain this sort of abstract information on to form these sort of analytical ways of looking at the mind. He understood that, or at least the way he saw it was, when you look at myths and the sky and, realizing that a lot of it revolves around, fantasy towards what a people's, will or qualities could potentially be. There's a lot of interesting stuff about that he has to say about that kind of stuff. And, one day I'd like to go, far deeper. This is just a kind of superficial look at it because it was just kind of something that I was thinking about. One day I'd like to appreciate him on a, far deeper level than I have right now. But I think, it was still, sufficient for this video. But I think, another avenue I'd like to go down is the relationship of knowledge and the father figure, because, we see when, in times of turmoil, in times of chaos, what we tend to do is go to, our past experiences. It's to recall memory. It's to recall those stories to be able to use, or to be able to use the archetypes, if you will. And I think what that really, shows is, what is the state of the relationship of, the father archetype, in the current world today. And, many times he's absent. And so, there's not really that knowledge able to, hark back on to be able to find, a way of trying to not just understand through those lessons as if they can just answer in totality, but to understand its own limitations. I think that's, part of the point of my contingency with people like Bacon when they were examining Aristotle and Plato and in the 16th century or 17th. I think I don't really think that they are ever necessarily going around and saying that they had the whole truth, but that they had a truth, and a truth that worked towards that particular archetype. This is kind of more of a Spenglerian sort of historical analysis, I guess I would say here. But out of these archetypes and, understanding of having these collective fantasies ultimately will still affect the way our political world is going about to this day. And I think you can actually see examples of this even in regards to Canada and the United States, for example. Um, you see a far more acceptance of these sort of totalitarian mandates as opposed to the U.S., of course. And I think that even goes back to the temperament of, all the way back in the revolutionary days where, people chose to go up north to, as opposed to being a part of, the radical revolution going on to the south of them. And I think that plays a lot into the politics between the two to this day. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to just denigrate Canadians, but I think we have to realize that these sort of temperaments don't just go away just because we stop talking about them. These archetypes and these alignments still are within us, even if they are harder to find. And I think trying to point them out is, part of the task of what it really means to be a dissident right now, and to try to find these patterns within them. And I think when you look at the similarities, not just on a superficial level of looking like each other, but understanding that there is an inherentness to the actual organs and structures within us, and what that would play in the arisal of the mind itself, and how that plays into morality, how that plays into the political, is something that's never really talked about anymore, or even considered, or taboo even. And I think trying to open up that dimension is important and something to consider. And but I think this is an expression of the father archetype, and the callback of knowledge. There's a feeling of an alignment. There's a feeling of harmony that I think someone like Plato would obviously say we would strive for. And so I think looking down upon that not only is just wrong, but I think it's actually somewhat superficial and vain, even though they would accuse others of the same thing. This is just their examination of what they think, this sort of aberrant model, simply because people think it's beautiful. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only reason why we would still embrace it. Even if it is the main one, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's why we're choosing to embrace a sort of material, superficial good, if you will. There could be something much deeper going on, if you will. This is just simply our senses, in a way, sort of aligning even towards that sort of material, easy to spot pattern. But what goes in the pattern itself is actually of importance as well, and requires a different sort of analysis than just simply superficial judgments on whether or not people are making material judgments. Yeah, so this was just another little video to ease my mind, I suppose. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.